love affair with stone. That's what I would say. That's at the base of the beginnings of the carving studio. A strange lover to choose or respond to, but that is the reality that has impacted my life most deeply and shaped it over the last 40 years. I came to Vermont for the first time in the mid-70s, looking for marble on the dump at the furthest reaches of the Vermont Marble Company yards in Proctor, knowing nothing of stone carving, but having carved wood for 2 or 3 years. Someone gave me a few rudimentary stone carving tools and a granite hammer, not even a marble hammer, and I learned to carve from a book, not able to find anyone who was teaching stone carving in the Boston area. I do have to admit that stone carving felt completely natural, as if I'd done it in a prior lifetime. And the process made me think of my stonemason grandfather, and of the name of my Italian town, Lapio, from the Latin lapis, meaning stone. Such were the beginnings. I tell you this only because these facts really reveal the reason that I started the carving studio, and probably some of the reasons that it still exists. My own journey began in 1971, and through the next 10 years, I scrounged about for knowledge that was hard to come by. Through divorce, single parenting of 3 children, working in social work for a living, carving at night, searching out the rare shows of carved sculpture I could find, haunting the public libraries in Boston and Cambridge, stealing into the Boston University Library, museum school libraries, to ferret out any books I could discover on carved sculpture. Discovering Brancusi, Hepworth, Moore, my first teachers in a solitary journey driven by a passion for stone. There was one inexplicable moment when, after hours in the museum school library, looking at books I couldn't borrow, I stood in the atrium and thought, if I could teach carving here, maybe I could make a difference. Maybe carving could again be considered part of a contemporary way of making art. It was a flash of a thought that quickly passed, a seeming anomaly in the throes of my very complicated life and private search. I met only one sculptor on the way, Bob Gove in California, a Zen monk of stone who had been to Carrara. One sculptor in all those years who knew carving intimately and who invited me to work there in 1980. That experience opened up my life, and that is how the idea of the studio was born. Out of that initial journey, working at the Nicoli studio in 1980, and then in Manuel Neri's studio during a Fulbright year in 1982 and 3. These experiences gave me a deep drink from a well of centuries of tradition. Being immersed in a marble world where artisans and sculptors breathed marble every day, where there was real knowledge to be had. That was an incredible and inspiring revelation. When I returned, I began teaching classes at the DeCordova Museum, the Art Institute of Boston, the Boston Museum School, and in my loft studio in Waltham, always with a vague but persistent dream of starting something in this country which resembled what I'd found in Italy. Always understanding that the city was a difficult place for an enterprise where noise, dust, and stone were essential ingredients. In 1986, I'd arranged with the museum school to take a group of students to Carrara for a 3-week trip when the Chernobyl nuclear plant blew up. My own father had died of brain cancer not long before, and I felt leery of bringing students to Europe under the circumstances. When I talked with the State Department, they assured me there was no problem. When I talked with friends and family in Italy, they said there were no fresh vegetables or dairy products. Fish were floating belly up in lakes. How could I willingly bring students into that? We had surmounted the terrorist crisis in Italy that year by rerouting the trip through London and Pisa rather than flying through Rome. But free radiation was a different story. I'd read about a sculptor, Paul Aschenbach, a University of Vermont professor who had worked in international symposia. He'd even brought sculptors from Europe and Japan for a symposium in Vermont. So I phoned him out of the blue and asked if he might be interested in hosting a group of students at his place in Charlotte. He politely declined, and suggested that I contact the Vermont Marble Company in Proctor, where I met Bob Blackwood, the plant manager. He was known to be a tough curmudgeon, but we hit it off. He was completely taken with the idea of students coming to Vermont instead of Carrara, and he gave us the back of an unused shed for 3 weeks in the summer of '86. I promised to bring up all the tools, work tables, air hoses from museum school. So it was a tough sell to the students, as many had been planning to come for over 2 years, and they thought of it as a life-changing decision. I took photos of the company yards and sheds in Proctor and convinced them that this was as close to Carrara as we could get in America. And 11 of the 12 students came and worked here for 3 weeks that summer. At the end of the course, I never left. Instead, I rented a small apartment from Alan Dwight, who carved out the Marble Company exhibit. $150 a month that I could ill afford. I decided to start the studio that winter. I'd sold a sculpture at Maudsley State Park, and half the money went to pay bills, and the other half went to buy a mailing list of professional sculptors and sculpture organizations across the United States. I got together the first bulk mailing of 2,000 pieces by myself in the Proctor apartment, a pretty daunting task, separating everything into zip codes. And the Proctor post office was very, very patient with me, I have to say. So I decided to start the studio on my own, not as part of the museum school, because my dream was to have a year-round program, a working studio where independent sculptors could come to work, where instruction was available for folks who wanted to learn, where teachers could come and bring their own students to work in a facility where there were tools, stone, everything necessary for carving. It was a big dream. I felt in organizing that mailing that I was putting messages into a bottle, sending them off into the sea of the world, not knowing if any would be found, if any replies would return. We had 2 3-week courses that first summer of 1987. People came from California, Louisiana, Michigan, North Carolina, Cincinnati, Boston, Washington, D.C. Hannah Israelson was the first person to send in a check, and I still remember holding it in my fingers with a deep sense of wonder. Almost before the courses were scheduled to begin, and when I knew there was enough money to pay her, I asked my teaching assistant from museum school, Carol Driscoll, to come up and help with the teaching. And so the carving studio was born in the old machine shop of the Vermont Marble Company, under tents designed and sewn by an architecture student from museum school, with the meals being cooked by Eric Laxman and my daughter Tiffany in my small Proctor apartment, and the chuck wagon arriving with hot food every day at 6 p.m. Evening slides were shown in the small marble block building, projected onto a makeshift screen. We also took our first of 2 carving studio trips to Carrara that year, laying the groundwork for future relationships with that mecca of stone knowledge. I met Stanley Gowett that summer of '87, but we didn't move to West Rutland until the end of the summer of 1989, spending the summers of '88 and '89 in the Callahan building, which had ample space for the numbers of carvers who were drawn to the studio. Essentially, we moved to West Rutland because the Vermont Marble Company was undergoing tremendous changes. Computers were doing the work that men had done for decades. The Plustoffer Omia Company, current owner, was invested in ground marble products, used as filler in paints and toothpaste, rather than dimensioned stone. The workforce in the plant had diminished to only a few workers, even during the 3 years I'd been there. We had to remake the studio every year in a different building, and there was never a guarantee at the end of the summer that there would be space available the next year. Stanley promised us a whole building that we could rent year-round. He believed in carving. I could look him in the eye and know who I was dealing with. So we used the summers of '88 and '89 to have the work-study students, our original interns, begin clearing debris out of the West Rutland building, trucking down boxes and boxes of marble cores, grinding graffiti off the outside walls, and preparing for the studio to move in the fall of 1989. West Rutland was a failed company town in the late '80s. Bars lined Marble Street, and the area in front of the studio was often the site of wild parties and burned-out cars. We participated in the transformation, hammer stroke by hammer stroke, paint stroke by paint stroke of renovation, from the ground up, always because of the energy of a cadre of dedicated volunteers. First folks I took over to view the site before we worked on it climbed all over the blocks, and Ty Wells, who has become a long-term board member, declared it carving camp. I had a feeling that we could make it work after that comment. The movement that rent needed to be paid every month if we wanted a year-round studio. Stanley was supportive, but he was a businessman. So 4 of us rented the studio: Carol Driscoll, Whit Humphreys, Eric Laxman, and myself. $100 each to cover the $400 a month rent during the winter months. And so the beginnings of the carving studio in West Rutland were born, and the rest, as they say, is history. From the first weekend classes using kerosene heaters and a chemical toilet to the present-day year-round facility. Some of the workbenches that we're still using were built by students on work weekends under Whit Humphrey's direction. It's hard to believe they've survived all this time. Don Ramey, my sculpture assistant from Lacoste, France, actually lived in the studio through a winter, helping to run electricity and keep the building open. Carol has been involved since the beginning and has been the stalwart director since 1998, which has provided an enormous thread of continuity from the very beginning to the present moment. She really has an understanding of the spirit of the studio and the generosity with which it was founded. And she has really kept that spirit going, and I'm very grateful for that. People came as participants or teachers, stayed, brought property, and have become strong and contributing members of the larger community. The love, labor, and generosity of many, many of you throughout the studio's history is what has kept the dream of the studio alive. It is only through that love and generosity that the studio exists, even today. It's quite humbling to look back on a history of nearly 30 years, to remember the first international carvers, Inuits from northern Canada, Takeo Ogai from Japan, Manuel Neri from California and Carrara, Sasha from Russia, and to witness today Irene Wanajuru from Kenya, Leonidas from Greece, Nora Valdez from Argentina, amongst many others who are resident artists and teachers here. And to remember our first bicentennial symposium in 1991. And as part of it, our creation of a monument to the stone tradition in the West Rutland community, carved by 2 Carrara carvers, Dino and Derno Ambrosini, and supported by Stanley Gowett. I think it's pretty significant that for our 30th anniversary, we're again having Carrara carvers carve a monument that is going to be a testament to the stone carving tradition here in the Rutland region, and that will be located in downtown Rutland. It's a fulfillment of a dream that this area has been recognizing more and more of its own history, and that we've had a stone bench project, and I see our stone benches throughout Rutland, Middlebury, Pulteney, different towns, and that now we will have more visibility in Rutland proper for the tradition that really helped create this place. And it's not insignificant that the carving studio is really the place that I consider the closest to Carrara in the United States, because we've brought together international resources. It's humbling and gratifying to see the wide range of talents brought together from the staff, interns, participants, visiting artists, and generous board members. It's really exhilarating to see the continued high quality of teaching and the visible results in the participants' work. inspiring to look out at the faces of so many of you who came for a visit, stayed, brought property, have become contributing members, not only of our small sculpture community, but of the larger one as well. Our collective effort has borne much ripe fruit, and hopefully will continue to do so in the seasons of the future. We've recently completed the circle of our connection to Carrara through establishing a sister studio there. Through Steve Shaheen's association with the Corsinini Studio, we now have a yearly program of exchange with some of the artisans whose forebears inspired me on my first journey in 1980. In fact, Leo Corsinini's father is one of the sculptors that I met when I first went to Carrara in 1980, and he was really known to be one of the most generous dispensers of knowledge and assistance to the foreign sculptors. We've come full circle, a miracle of 30 years. I guess that my Italian grandmother would call it destino, destiny. So here we are, looking back and looking ahead. Your ideas and energies are what will carry us into the next 30. Sempre avanti, another Italian expression that means always forward.